The story tonight is about hacking. It's a word that has changed its meaning a lot over the past 60 years or so. When it was first used, in the way we now use it, it meant something almost the opposite of what most people now think of when they hear it. It referred to a kind of playful, clever exploration of technical systems, the activity of figuring out how something worked by taking it apart and putting it back together. The satisfaction of finding an elegant solution to a small problem. Over the decades, the word drifted. It picked up new associations. By the time most people use it now in ordinary conversation, it tends to refer to people who break into other people's computers. Both meanings are still in use. Somewhere, they live, somewhat uncomfortably, inside the same word. Tonight, we're going to walk through the whole arc of how hacking became what it became. From a basement at a college in Massachusetts in the late 1950s, through the phone systems of the 1970s, through the bedroom break-ins of the 1980s, and into the strange professionalized world that hacking is now. There are a lot of people in this story. Most of them are young at the time the story finds them. Most of them are men. Almost all of them are doing what they are doing, at least at first because they find it interesting, not because they are trying to cause anyone any harm. Before we go any further, though, take a moment. The day is done. Whatever the day brought, it's behind you now, and the only thing you need to do for the next several hours is rest. Let the blanket find where it wants to be. Let your hands rest wherever they happened to be resting. Let the back of your head settle a little deeper into the pillow. Let your face go soft. You won't need to remember any of what's coming. That's the way these recordings work. If you fall asleep 5 minutes from now, the story keeps telling itself, and the names and the dates can drift past you without any consequence. If you wake up later in the small hours of the morning and have no idea what we're talking about, that's also fine. The story doesn't need you to follow it. It will be there when you come back, and it will be there in the morning too, in the same shape it always was. One thing before we begin, and then we can settle in for real. If a voice like this in the dark on a long night is the kind of thing you'd like to have around on other nights, there's a subscribe button somewhere on the screen. You can tap it now, before you forget. And if you're inclined, you can leave a comment with where you happen to be listening from tonight. The comments fill up, slowly, with notes from people in all kinds of rooms in all kinds of cities, and there turns out to be something quietly comforting about scrolling through them later, knowing that a few hundred other people were also somewhere in the same long night, settling in for the same long story. No pressure, just if you want to. That's the only thing I'll ask of you tonight. The story begins the way these technical stories often begin, with a group of young men in a basement room, where a hobby was about to turn, without anyone quite noticing, into something else. Chapter 1. A Model Railroad Club. The basement room belonged to a student club at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge. The club was called the Tech Model Railroad Club, which it had been called since the late 1940s. The club had a large room in the basement of one of the engineering buildings, and the room contained, by the late 1950s, an elaborate model railroad layout that the members had been building and modifying and elaborating on for over a decade. The layout had multiple tracks, multiple trains, multiple switches and signals and crossings. The members had built beneath the layout an enormous tangle of wires and relays and switches that controlled which trains went where, when they stopped, when they started, when their signals lit up. The underside of the layout by the late 50s was almost as elaborate as the trains running on top. The members of the club were divided, by their own inclinations, into two groups. One group cared about the trains. They built the engines, painted the cars, designed the scenery, planned the routes. The other group cared about the wiring underneath. They built the relay systems, designed the switching circuits, figured out how to make the signals and the switches respond to whichever train was running through. The two groups had different names for what they did. The train-focused group called their work modeling. The wiring-focused group called their work, among themselves, hacking. They had a hacking subcommittee. They worked on hacking the system. A particularly elegant solution to a wiring problem was called, in their language, a hack. The word, in this usage, was older than the Model Railroad Club. It had been used in similar ways at various American colleges for several decades before to refer to a clever practical solution, often a temporary one, often one that worked through some non-obvious approach. To hack something was to make it work in a way that the original designers had not specifically planned for by combining the available pieces in a new arrangement. The word had a positive connotation. A hack was something to be admired. A hacker was someone who could find such solutions. Around 1959, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology acquired its first large computer. The machine was made by a company called Digital Equipment Corporation, which was based in a converted woolen mill not far from the campus. The machine was called the TX-0, and it was, by the standards of the time, an unusually approachable kind of computer. Most computers in the late 1950s were locked in air-conditioned rooms, accessible only through professional staff who fed in punched cards and brought back printed output. The TXO was different. Students could sit at it directly and interact with it through a typewriter-like console and a small screen. The students could write programs and watch them run. They could modify the programs while the programs were running. They could see, in something close to real time, what the machine was doing. The members of the Model Railroad Club, the ones in the wiring subcommittee, discovered the TXO within weeks of its arrival. They had been doing the equivalent of programming for years, in the form of the elaborate relay systems they had built under the train layout, but they had never used an actual computer. The computer was for them a revelation. It could do in seconds what their relays did in minutes. It could be reconfigured by typing rather than by rewiring. It would run any procedure they could specify in its language, no matter how complicated. They started spending all their available time at it. The names of the early TX-0 users have been preserved by a generation of historians of computing who have been interested in the period for various reasons. There was Peter Sampson, who wrote one of the first computer music programs, getting the TX-0 to play Bach. There was Alan Kotok, who would later become one of the principal designers of the next generation of computers. There was Steve Russell, who would later create one of the first computer games called Space War. There were various others. They worked mostly at night when the machine was less in demand. They taught themselves, by trial and error, what the machine could do. They wrote programs for the pleasure of writing them. They built tools that made other programs easier to write. They started, slowly, to develop a culture around the activity. Some of the things they built were, by any reasonable standard, unimportant. Peter Sampson, after he had taught the TX-0 to play Bach, taught it to play other things. Popular songs, novelty tunes, snippets of compositions he wrote himself. He did this for no particular reason. The machine was not designed to make music. There was no commercial application for it. He did it because he wanted to see if it could be done. Steve Russell, in the same spirit, spent months building Space War, which was a game in which two players controlled spaceships on a screen and tried to shoot each other. The game ran on the TXO's small display, which had been intended for showing the output of scientific calculations. Russell had figured out that the display could be used for graphics instead, and had built the game largely to demonstrate the possibility. The game became, over the following years, the canonical example of what computers could be used for besides serious work. It would, eventually, inspire an entire industry of computer games. But in the early 60s, it was just a thing Russell had built because he thought it would be fun. What is striking, looking back at the early MIT scene from a distance, is how much of what would later become important in computing came out of this kind of unstructured play. The graphical user interface, the computer game, the music software, the time-shared operating system, the programming languages that would shape the next several decades. Many of the foundations of these things were laid by the small group of students who had been allowed to play with the new computers in the basement at MIT, mostly without any specific goal in mind. The institutional culture had created a space in which play was allowed to develop into serious work over time. The students, in their playing, had developed the skills and ideas that would, decades later, turn out to be foundational. The culture had certain values that the members of it would, in retrospect, recognize as a coherent ethic. Systems should be approachable. Information about how systems worked should be shared freely. Clever solutions should be admired regardless of who came up with them. Authority and credentials mattered less than the elegance of one's actual work. The right way to learn how something worked was to take it apart. The right way to fix it was to put it back together in some improved form. This set of values, which was unwritten and unnamed at the time, would later be called the hacker ethic, after a journalist named Stephen Levy wrote a book by that name in the early 1980s. Levy's book was titled Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution, and it was published in 1984. Levy had spent several years interviewing the original MIT hackers, then in their 40s or so, and asking them to describe what they had done in the late 50s and early 60s. The book that resulted was, by most accounts, the first major work of journalism that took the early hacker community seriously as a cultural phenomenon worth describing. It traced the path from the Model Railroad Club, through the early MIT computer culture, into the personal computer revolution of the 70s, and ended with a survey of the game programmers of the early 80s. Levy organized the values of the original community into what he called the 6 principles of the hacker ethic. which the book laid out in some detail. The principles included things like the idea that access to computers should be unlimited and total, that all information should be free, that authority should be mistrusted, and that hackers should be judged by their work rather than by their academic credentials. The book had, for the years immediately after its publication, a particular cultural role. It became the canonical text by which later generations of hackers learned about their own history. People who had not been at MIT, who had grown up far from any computer culture, would read Levy's book and recognize, in the values he described, something they themselves had been feeling without having known there was a name for it. The book sold steadily for decades. It is, as of these recordings, still in print, and is still occasionally given to new arrivals in technical fields as a way of introducing them to where their profession came from. The students who developed this culture in the basement at MIT did not see themselves as doing anything particularly transgressive. They were exploring a new kind of machine. They were having fun. They were learning. The institutional structures of MIT were generally supportive of what they were doing since the institute had been built, more or less, around the idea that bright young people should be allowed to explore technical systems freely. The administrators looked the other way when the students stayed all night. The professors gave them informal credit for their work. The computer room, for those who could get into it, became a kind of clubhouse, where the activity of programming was treated as a craft worth pursuing for its own sake. What was important about the MIT scene, more than any particular achievement that came out of it, was that it established a model of what a hacker was. The model had two components. The first was the technical skill, the ability to understand systems deeply, to find clever solutions, to make machines do what one wanted them to do. The second was a particular kind of attitude, playful, exploratory, irreverent toward institutional authority, generous with knowledge, suspicious of secrecy. These two components together defined the original meaning of the word. For the next decade or so, the word would be used, mostly inside the small community of programmers who knew about it, in this positive sense. The model would, in the 1970s, leak out of MIT and start to apply to a broader set of people, working on different kinds of technical systems in different parts of the country. It would acquire new associations as it spread. By the time it became a household word, in the 1980s, it would mean something quite different. But the original sense, the one developed in the basement at MIT in the late 1950s, would persist as a kind of older meaning, kept alive by the people who remembered it. Like an older sense of a word that has since gone in a different direction. Chapter 2. The Telephone People. The next chapter of the story does not happen at MIT, although it overlaps with MIT in various ways. It happens mostly inside the telephone system, which in the 1960s was one of the largest and most complicated technical systems in the world. The telephone system at the time was operated by a single company in the United States. The company was called the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, or AT&T for short, or just the phone company in everyday speech. It was, by the 1960s, a vast organization with hundreds of thousands of employees, with telephone wires running into nearly every building in the country, with switching centers in every city that routed calls through the network. The company was, by some measures, the largest corporation in the world. It was certainly one of the most technically sophisticated. Its engineers, at the research laboratories called Bell Labs, had developed many of the foundational technologies of modern electronics, including the transistor, including the basic mathematics of information theory. The telephone system, in the 1960s, was beginning to switch over from a fully mechanical method of routing calls to an electronic one. The new method used tones. When you dialed a number, the dialing wheel of the telephone produced electrical pulses that traveled through the wires and told the switching equipment which number you were trying to call. Inside the telephone network, the switching centers communicated with each other using tones at specific frequencies, which signaled various things about the call: that the call was being placed, that the destination was ringing, that the call had been answered, that the call had ended. The tones were standardized. The frequencies were precisely specified. The internal workings of the system, by the mid-60s, had become a complicated dance of audible signals at specific frequencies, mostly inaudible to the customer but flowing constantly through the wires. There was, at this same time, a small community of mostly young people scattered around the United States who had become fascinated by the telephone system. They were not employees of the phone company. They were curious outsiders. They had figured out, mostly by accident at first and then increasingly on purpose, that the telephone system could be exploited in various interesting ways by anyone who understood how it worked. The people who did this came to call themselves phone freaks, with the word freak spelled with a phi rather than an F, in a deliberate echo of the way the phone company spelled its own name. The activity they engaged in came to be called phone freaking. It was, in many ways, the first form of what would later be called hacking. The phone freaks were figuring out how a large technical system worked, by exploring its edges and then using what they had figured out to do things that the system's designers had not specifically intended. The most famous of the phone freaks in the early years was a young man whose name was Joe Engressia. Engressia was blind, having been blind from birth, and had been raised in Richmond, Virginia. He had an unusual gift, which was perfect pitch. He could identify musical notes by ear with great precision. As a young child, he had discovered, while playing with the family telephone, that he could whistle certain tones into the receiver and cause unusual things to happen. He could disconnect calls. He could make the system do strange things. He didn't fully understand what he was doing, but he found it endlessly fascinating, and he spent hours of his childhood whistling into telephones to see what would happen. By the time Engressia reached his 20s, in the late 1960s, he had figured out a great deal about the telephone system. He had discovered, among other things, that whistling a tone at exactly 2,600 cycles per second, which was a frequency the phone system used internally to signal that a long-distance line was available, would let him make long-distance calls without being charged. He had also become a kind of central figure in the small community of phone freaks that had grown up around the country, partly because he was extremely knowledgeable about the system, and partly because, as a blind person, he had developed his understanding through pure exploration rather than through any kind of formal training. He talked to other freaks for hours on the telephone, exchanging information about how the system worked. he came to be known in the community as Joy Bubbles. That was the name he eventually took as his own. Legally, what was striking about Ingressia to the people who knew him was the gentleness of his relationship to the phone system. He did not, by his own description, want to harm the phone company. He did not want to make money. He wanted simply to understand the system. The phone system, for him, was a kind of vast, invisible musical instrument, full of tones and patterns and responses that no one else seemed to be paying attention to. He spent his life listening to it. He maintained in his later years a service that was simply a recorded message, which he would record fresh each week, offering musings on whatever was on his mind. People would call the number, listen to the message, hang up. The whole thing was funded by his own modest savings. It was an entirely useless service in any commercial sense. It was, in some way, an extension of his original relationship to the phone system. He liked the idea of voices traveling through wires for no particular reason, and he wanted to add his own voice to the traffic. The other most famous of the phone freaks was a young man named John Draper, who had been a radar technician in the United States Air Force and had developed an interest in the phone system after being discharged. Draper had figured out, around 1971, that a particular toy whistle that came as a prize in boxes of a certain breakfast cereal, a cereal called Cap'n Crunch, produced a tone that was, by coincidence, exactly the 2,600 cycle frequency that Joy Bubbles had been whistling. Draper had figured out that you could blow this whistle into a telephone receiver and the phone system would respond as if a long-distance line had become free, and that you could then use various follow-up tones to route a call wherever you wanted, without being billed. Draper, who took on the nickname Captain Crunch in honor of his discovery, started traveling around the country, making calls from payphones, exploring the system. He became, for a few years, one of the most notorious phone freaks in the United States. Draper's relationship to the phone system was different from Ingressia's in ways that came to matter. Where Ingressia was gentle, exploratory, content to listen and understand, Draper was more boisterous, more drawn to attention, more likely to use what he had learned to embarrass the phone company. He was arrested for the first time in 1972, and would be arrested several more times over the following decades, for various offenses related to his freak activities. Each arrest brought him more notoriety. The phone company, when it talked about freaks at all, tended to talk about Draper as the central villain of the story, even though there were many other freaks doing similar things more quietly. The community of phone freaks built devices, over the following years, that could produce the various tones the phone system used. These devices came to be called blue boxes, because the earliest ones happened to be built inside small blue plastic enclosures. A blue box was, in essence, a small electronic device that could play, on demand, any of the tones that the phone system used internally. With a blue box, a phone freak could effectively become a phone company employee from the system's point of view, routing calls, looking up numbers, manipulating the network in ways that ordinary customers could not. The blue boxes were technically illegal since they let their users make calls without paying. The phone company knew about them and considered them a serious problem. The FBI knew about them too. Over the late 60s and early 70s, there were various investigations, various arrests, various prosecutions of people who had been caught using or selling blue boxes. The community of phone freaks, despite this, was small enough and decentralized enough that it mostly continued. In October of 1971, a journalist named Ron Rosenbaum wrote a long article about the phone freaks for Esquire magazine. The article was titled Secrets of the Little Blue Box. It described, in considerable detail, who the freaks were, how they operated, what their culture was like. The article was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential pieces of journalism in the history of computing. It did several things. It made the phone freaks famous, briefly, in the wider culture. It also, more importantly, came to the attention of two young men in California, who would, after reading it, decide to build and sell their own blue boxes. The two young men were Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. The money they made selling blue boxes, in their early 20s, would be part of what funded the founding of Apple Computer a few years later. Wozniak has said in interviews many years afterward that without the blue box business, there would have been no Apple. The line is not exactly literally true, but it captures something important about the connection between the phone freaks and the computer industry that grew out of them. Rosenbaum's article is, even now, an unusually good piece of writing about a technical subculture. He had spent months with the freaks. He had ridden along on their late-night calling sessions. He had heard their stories firsthand. The article captured the particular feeling of the community, the mix of technical obsession and outlaw camaraderie. The late-night calls that went on for hours, the way the freaks would test each other's knowledge of obscure switching equipment, the strange intimacy that developed between people who had never met but had been on the same conference call together for years. The article is, in some ways, the canonical document of the freak era. Most accounts of phone freaking written since have drawn, in one way or another, from what Rosenbaum found and recorded in those months. The phone freak community shaped, in various ways, the culture of what would later be called hacking. It established the idea that an outsider could understand a large technical system better than the system's official operators, by exploring it from the outside. It established the idea that the activity of such exploration was, for the people who did it, more about curiosity than about profit. It established the idea that this kind of exploration could be done in a community, with shared knowledge and shared techniques, even when the community was distributed across the country and most of its members had never met. By the time the personal computer arrived in the mid-70s, the phone freaks were already there, ready to bring their habits of exploration to the new machines. Joy Bubbles died in 2007 at the age of 58 in Minneapolis, where he had been living for many years. Captain Crunch, by various reports, was still alive in his 80s as of these recordings, still occasionally giving interviews about his life in the early days of the phone freak community. Most of the rest of the freaks have been less easy to track. They were, by their nature, a community that valued anonymity. Their work survives mostly in the form of the cultural patterns they set down, which the next generation of hackers, working on the new personal computers, would inherit without always knowing where the patterns had come from. Let's take a small pause here. Before going on, the story has plenty of road ahead, and there's no need to be in any rush about it. If your shoulders have climbed back up toward your ears, let them drop. If the blanket has slipped, you can settle it back. The room around you is the same quiet room it was when we started. Nothing about the next several hours is asking anything of you. The story keeps its shape whether you're following it closely or only catching the occasional sentence. Either way is fine. Chapter 3. The Bedroom Break-Ins. The next chapter of the story takes us forward by about a decade to the early 1980s, when the personal computer had become widely available and when, for the first time, young people in their own bedrooms could be programmers without belonging to any particular institution. The arrival of the personal computer changed the demographics of what would later be called hacking. The phone freaks had been mostly in their 20s or 30s, scattered across the country, in touch with each other mostly by phone. The new computer users were often teenagers sitting in their own bedrooms, in touch with each other through bulletin board systems that they reached by dialing up over their phone lines. The activity that had been called phone freaking, when it involved exploring the phone system, came to be called hacking when it involved exploring computer systems. The word had not yet, in the early 80s, picked up the negative associations it would have later. It was still mostly a neutral or positive term, used inside the small community of people who knew what it referred to. What changed in the early 80s was that the small community got somewhat bigger and started to do things that attracted public attention. The most famous incident, the one that brought hacking into the mainstream American consciousness, involved a group of 6 teenagers in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who had been using their home computers to dial into various computer systems around the country. The teenagers, all aged between 16 and 22, had picked the name the 414s for themselves, after the telephone area code for Milwaukee. They had been doing what they were doing by their own later accounts, mostly for fun. They were curious about whether they could get into various computer systems. They had figured out that many large computer systems in the early 80s had default passwords that the system administrators had never bothered to change. They had figured out how to find such systems and to log into them, often without any sophisticated technique beyond just trying common passwords. Over a period of months in 1983, the 414s had gotten into a remarkable variety of computer systems. They had gotten into the computer system at a major hospital in New York, which kept records on patient treatments. They had gotten into a computer system belonging to a national laboratory that did weapons research. They had gotten into the system of a cement company in Canada. They had gotten into various university computers. They had not, by their own later accounts, done anything malicious. They had looked around. They had occasionally left small notes for the system administrators, saying they had been there. They had not changed any data or taken anything. They had been, by their own description, like teenage explorers who had figured out how to get into various unlocked buildings in the middle of the night, just to see what was inside. The leader of the 414s, insofar as the group had a leader, was a young man named Neil Patrick, who had been 17 at the time of the intrusions. Patrick had been a high school student at a private school in Milwaukee. He had been, by most accounts, an unremarkable teenager in most respects, beyond his particular interest in computers. He had begun using his home computer to dial into various systems, mostly out of curiosity, and had eventually gathered a small group of friends to do the same. The activities of the group had been, at the time, almost entirely social. They would call into a system, look around, leave a message, log off, and then talk about it with the others on the next bulletin board they connected to. Patrick, after the arrest, was the public face of the group, because he was the oldest and was therefore the most often interviewed. He testified before Congress in late 1983 in hearings that had been arranged in part because of the publicity around the case. His testimony, watched by various members of the House of Representatives, was the first time many members of Congress had ever heard, in plain language, what a computer intrusion actually involved. He explained, in the testimony, that the group had not been criminals in any conventional sense. They had been curious. The systems they had broken into had been, in most cases, embarrassingly easy to get into. The teenagers had not needed to do anything especially clever. They had just tried common passwords. The systems had let them in. The 414s were caught in the summer of 1983, after one of the institutions they had gotten into noticed the intrusion and contacted the FBI. The FBI traced the calls back through the phone network and arrived at the houses of the 6 teenagers, mostly in Milwaukee, in a coordinated raid. The teenagers were interviewed. Their computers were taken. The case got enormous press coverage. The story of teenagers breaking into government computers from their bedrooms struck the public imagination in a particular way that it had not been struck before. Newsweek put one of the teenagers on its cover, with the headline, "Beware, Hackers at Play." The article inside used the word hacker in the new sense, the sense that meant computer intruder, the sense that would, over the following years, become the dominant meaning of the word in popular usage. The Newsweek article was, by general agreement, the moment when the word hacker shifted, in American English, from the older positive meaning to the newer negative one. The shift had been happening, gradually, for several years, but the cover story made it official. From 1983 onward, when most non-technical Americans heard the word hacker, they would think of teenagers in bedrooms breaking into computers, not of MIT students writing elegant programs. The older meaning would persist in the technical community, but it would lose its place in the broader culture. The 414s were, eventually, mostly let off with warnings or with light sentences. They had not been malicious, they had not been adults. The laws around computer intrusion in 1983 were still being figured out, and the existing laws didn't fit very well. Several of the teenagers went on to ordinary professional lives. None of them, by most accounts, became serious hackers in the criminal sense. They were ordinary, curious teenagers who had stumbled into something that, the year before, would have been considered a clever exploit, and that, the year after, would be considered a federal crime. A few weeks after the 414s were arrested, a movie called War Games came out in American theaters. The movie starred a young Matthew Broderick as a teenager who, using his bedroom computer, accidentally got into a Pentagon system that controlled the nation's nuclear missiles, and who, in trying to play what he thought was a computer game, nearly started a nuclear war. The movie was, technically, terrible. The computer in the movie did things that no real computer would do, but the movie was a huge hit. It crystallized in the public mind an image of what hackers were: lonely teenagers in bedrooms, capable of doing enormous damage with their home computers. Dangerous in a way that the previous generation of curious young people had not been dangerous. The 414s had been real. War games had been fictional. But the two, in the public mind, blurred together. The combination of the news coverage and the movie set the public's understanding of hacking for the next several decades. War games had been, by various accounts, watched by President Ronald Reagan at the White House a few weeks before its theatrical release. Reagan had, several days later, asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff whether the scenario depicted in the movie, a teenager remotely getting into Pentagon computers, was actually possible. The Joint Chiefs had taken the question seriously enough to study it. They had, after some investigation, concluded that the scenario was more plausible than they had previously assumed. The internal review that resulted, conducted over the following months, became one of the inputs into the eventual passage of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in 1986. The whole sequence, a teenager hacking story in a movie, a question from the president, a government review, and a federal law, is a peculiar example of how popular culture and policy sometimes interact. The actual hackers of the early 80s, the ones in their bedrooms and at their computers, were watching this all happen with mixed feelings. On one hand, they were getting a kind of glamour that the older generation of programmers had never had. On the other hand, the kind of activity they had been doing for fun was, suddenly, being treated as a national security threat. The legal landscape was changing. The United States Congress passed the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in 1986, which for the first time established clear federal penalties for unauthorized access to computer systems. The penalties were significant. The era when a curious teenager could explore a computer system without much consequence was, by the late 80s, ending what was beginning in its place. Was an era in which hackers would have to be more careful, more organized, and more aware that what they were doing was increasingly illegal. The community would not stop. It would, in some ways, grow more interesting as it adapted to the new conditions. But it would, from the mid-80s onward, exist in a different relationship to the rest of society than it had occupied before. What was beginning, in its place, was an era in which hackers would have to be more careful, more organized, and more aware that what they were doing was increasingly illegal. The community would not stop. It would, in some ways, grow more interesting as it adapted to the new conditions. But it would, from the mid-80s onward, exist in a different relationship to the rest of society than it had occupied before. Chapter 4. The Hacker Quarterly. In the summer of 1984, a young man in Long Island named Eric Corley started a magazine. Corley was in his mid-20s at the time. He had grown up in New York. He had been a phone freak as a teenager. He had been involved in the bulletin board scene as it developed in the early 80s. He had decided that what the hacking community needed was a magazine, a printed publication, distributed through the mail, that would document what the hackers of the day were doing and would preserve their accumulated knowledge for the future. The magazine he started was called 2600, the Hacker Quarterly. The number 2600 was a reference to the frequency in the phone system that Joy Bubbles had whistled all those years before to get free long-distance calls. The name signaled, to anyone who knew the history, that the magazine considered itself an heir to the phone phreak tradition. Corley, for purposes of writing in the magazine, gave himself the pen name Emmanuel Goldstein, which was a reference to the dissident character in George Orwell's novel 1984. The pen name said, again to those who knew the reference, that the magazine considered itself a voice of opposition to what its editor considered the increasingly surveillance-heavy direction of American society. The first issue of 2600 was photocopied. It was 8 pages long. It contained articles about how various phone systems worked, about how to use various computer systems, about the recent legal cases involving hackers. It was, by the standards of magazine publishing, primitive, but it was the first publication of its kind. It went out by mail to a small subscriber list, and the subscriber list grew, slowly over the following months. By the end of 1985, 2600 had thousands of subscribers. By the end of the 80s, it had tens of thousands. It is, as of these recordings, still being published. The articles in 2600 were written by hackers, for hackers. They explained how various systems worked, how various security mechanisms could be circumvented, what various tools and techniques were available. The magazine took the position that this kind of information should be public. The argument, which Corley and his contributors made repeatedly over the years, was that security through obscurity was no security at all. If a computer system had a vulnerability, hiding the vulnerability did not make the system safer. It just meant that only people willing to do their own research, including the people most likely to abuse the vulnerability, would know about it. Publishing the vulnerability, the argument went, would put pressure on the system's owners to fix it, and would let the broader community of users protect themselves until it was fixed. This argument was not universally accepted. The phone company hated 2600. Various computer companies hated 2600. The FBI took an active interest in the magazine for years. The argument that publishing security vulnerabilities was, on balance, beneficial would, over the following decades, become more widely accepted within the security community. But in the 80s it was a contentious position. 2600 was, throughout this period, one of the few publications willing to take the position openly. Around the same time that 2600 was being founded, another publication of the same general type was being started, but in electronic form rather than printed form. The electronic publication was called Phrack, with the spelling deliberately combining the words phreak and hack. Phrack was distributed over the bulletin board systems that hackers used to communicate with each other. Anyone with a modem and the right phone number could call into one of the boards and download the latest issue. Phrack was, in its early years, more technical than 2600, more focused on the specific details of how particular systems worked and how they could be exploited. It became, through the late 80s, one of the central institutions of the hacker community. The bulletin board systems themselves, which Phrack was distributed through, were a particular kind of computing institution that has mostly been forgotten now. A bulletin board system, or BBS, was a small computer, often in someone's bedroom or basement, that other computers could call into over the phone. When you called into a BBS, you could read messages that other callers had left, leave your own messages, download files, upload files, play primitive multiplayer games. Each BBS had its own community of regulars, its own personality, its own particular interests. There were thousands of BBSs in the United States by the late 1980s, covering every imaginable topic. The ones that focused on hacking and phone phreaking were, by the late 80s, the central social spaces of the hacker community. People who would never meet in person would spend years exchanging messages on the same boards, learning each other's quirks, building friendships and rivalries that were entirely text-based. The most famous of the hacker bulletin boards, in their various heydays, had names that the regulars remembered for years. There was a board called Plovernet, which had been run by a teenager in Florida in the early 1980s, and which had been one of the first places where the hackers of the day had gathered electronically. There was a board called Black Ice Private, which had been one of the most exclusive hacker boards of the mid-80s, with membership by invitation only. There was a board called the Phoenix Project, which had been run by a hacker named The Mentor in the late 1980s. The Mentor had written on his own board a short essay that became one of the canonical texts of the hacker community. The essay, which the Mentor had written after he had been arrested in early 1986, was titled The Hacker Manifesto. It was about 1,000 words long. It described, in the first person, the feeling of being a young hacker, the boredom with conventional school, the discovery of computers, the excitement of figuring out how systems worked, the sense of finding a community of fellow seekers in the otherwise lonely world of teenage outsiderness. The essay was passed around the bulletin board scene for years, and was read by some estimates, every serious hacker who came of age in the late 80s and 90s. It is, as of these recordings, still circulated on various corners of the internet and is still encountered by young people who find themselves drawn, in the same general way, to the activity it described. The bulletin board scene was in many ways the closest predecessor to what the internet would later become. It had similar dynamics. It had the same kind of anonymous handle culture, where people knew each other by their nicknames rather than their real names. It had the same kind of community-based knowledge accumulation, where information that one person figured out would spread, through the boards, to thousands of others. It had the same kind of cat and mouse with law enforcement, since some of the boards were under FBI surveillance and some of the regulars were unknown to the others, informants. The bulletin board era ended, more or less, in the mid-1990s, when the internet became widely available and the boards became obsolete. The internet did what the boards had done, faster and more widely. But the boards had, in their decade or so of dominance, established many of the patterns that the hacker community would carry forward into the internet age. The pseudonymous identity, the technical sharing, the community of strangers connected by their shared interest in how things worked, all of these came out of the bulletin board scene. By the time the internet arrived, the hackers were already organized. They just moved their conversations to the new medium. There was one particular moment in the bulletin board era that deserves to be mentioned, because it brought the relationship between the hacker community and the federal government to a head in a way that would echo for years afterward. The moment came in May of 1990. The United States Secret Service, which had jurisdiction over many computer crimes at the time, launched a series of coordinated raids on hackers around the country. The operation was called Operation Sun Devil. Over the course of a few days, federal agents executed search warrants in 14 cities. They seized computers. They seized hard drives. They seized bulletin board systems. They arrested various hackers. The operation had been planned for over a year. It was, by the standards of the time, the largest enforcement action against hackers in American history. The actual results of Operation Sun Devil were, in retrospect, modest. Only a handful of the people arrested were ever charged with crimes. Several of the prosecutions that did go forward fell apart on appeal. One particular case, involving a hacker named Craig Niedorf, who had been charged with publishing a stolen telephone company document in FRAC, was dismissed when it turned out that the document the prosecution had described as a major theft of valuable proprietary information was, in fact, freely available for purchase from the phone company for about $13. The case became a kind of cautionary tale within the legal community about prosecutors who did not understand the technology they were prosecuting. The aftermath of Operation Sun Devil had several consequences. The hacker community, which had been operating with a kind of casual openness in the years before, became more guarded. The bulletin boards became, in some cases, more carefully secured. Some of the hackers who had been most active on the boards went quiet for several years. At the same time, a group of civil libertarians, watching the prosecutions go badly, decided that there needed to be a legal advocacy organization specifically focused on the rights of computer users. They founded an organization called the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which would over the following decades become one of the most important advocates for digital civil liberties in the United States. The foundation had its origins, in some ways, in the overreach of Operation Sun Devil and in the broader sense, among observers of the hacker community at the time, that the federal government did not yet know how to think about the activity it was trying to police. A journalist named Bruce Sterling wrote a book about Operation Sun Devil and the surrounding events, which was published in 1992. The book was called The Hacker Crackdown. It documented, in considerable detail, what had happened during the operation and what the various participants, the hackers, the phone company, the federal agents, the lawyers, had been thinking. The book became, like Levy's book before it, one of the canonical texts of the hacker community. It remains in print as of these recordings. Chapter 5. The Most Wanted. In February of 1995, the FBI arrested a man at his apartment in Raleigh, North Carolina. The man was in his early 30s. He had been on the run from federal authorities for several years. He had been the subject of articles in major newspapers, of an FBI manhunt, of a book that had not yet been published but was already being written. He was, at the time of his arrest, probably the most famous computer hacker in the world. His name was Kevin Mitnick. Mitnick had been born in 1963 in Van Nuys, California, in the San Fernando Valley north of Los Angeles. His parents had divorced when he was 3. He had been raised mostly by his mother in modest circumstances. He had been a lonely child, by his own later account, and had found refuge first in amateur radio and then, in his early teens, in the phone system. He had been one of the younger phone freaks of the late 1970s, hanging around with older freaks who taught him their techniques. By the time he was 16, he was an experienced freak. By the time he was 20, he had moved on from phone systems to computer systems and had started exploring various computer networks that businesses used in the early 1980s. What made Mitnick unusual among the hackers of his generation was his particular emphasis on what came to be called social engineering. Most hackers in the 80s focused on technical attacks. They would find software vulnerabilities, exploit them, get into systems through technical means. Mitnick was capable of doing this, and did do it, but his real specialty was talking his way in. He would call a company on the phone, pretend to be an employee from a different department, ask for information that would help him get further into the system. He had an unusual gift for accents, for impersonation, for the small social cues that made him sound like he belonged on whatever phone call he was making. He could call a phone company employee, pretend to be a fellow technician, and get the employee to read off passwords or to make changes to the system that would let him in. The technique worked surprisingly often because most security systems were designed to keep outsiders from getting in through the front door, but were not very well prepared to handle someone who simply pretended to already be inside. Mitnick was arrested for the first time when he was 17 for having broken into a phone company computer. He was sent to a juvenile detention center for several months. After his release, he kept doing what he had been doing. He was arrested several more times over the next few years for various computer-related offenses. He kept getting out. He kept hacking. In 1988, he was sentenced to a year in federal prison for breaking into a Digital Equipment Corporation computer and stealing some of their software. He served the sentence. When he got out, he was put on probation. He violated the probation. The federal authorities started looking for him. For the next 2 years, Mitnick was a fugitive. He moved between various American cities, using false identities, getting low-paying jobs under fake names, living in cheap apartments. He kept hacking the whole time. He hacked the cellular phone networks. He hacked various corporate systems. He stole, by some estimates, millions of dollars worth of software. By the early 1990s, he had become, in the eyes of federal law enforcement, one of the most wanted computer criminals in the United States. The hunt for Mitnick became, in the mid-90s, a kind of cat-and-mouse drama that the press covered extensively. The hunter, on the FBI side, was a researcher named Tsutomu Shimomura, who worked at the San Diego Supercomputer Center and who had become involved after Mitnick had hacked into one of his own computers in late 1994. Shimomura, who had been a serious computer security researcher for years, devoted himself to tracking Mitnick down. He traced the calls. He analyzed the patterns of activity. He used various technical methods to narrow down the location from which Mitnick was operating. By February of 1995, he had traced Mitnick to a specific apartment building in Raleigh, North Carolina. The FBI moved in. Mitnick was arrested in his apartment, where he had been living, by all accounts quietly, for several months. Shimomura was in many ways an unusual figure to find at the center of a federal manhunt. He had been born in Japan, raised partly in the United States, and had become, by his early 30s, one of the more respected computer security researchers in the country. He was not, by profession, a law enforcement agent. He was an academic. But he had taken Mitnick's intrusion personally. When Mitnick had broken into Shimomura's computers on Christmas Day of 1994, he had not only stolen various files, he had also left taunting voicemail messages on Shimomura's answering machine. The combination of the technical intrusion and the personal taunting had made the case, for Shimomura, into a kind of obligation. He had spent the following weeks of his life chasing Mitnick across the country, using techniques that he had developed himself for tracing intrusions through the new and largely uncharted networks of the early commercial Internet. The chase was, by the accounts of the various people involved, an unusual experience. The Internet of early 1995 was not yet the constantly surveilled commercial network it would later become. There were relatively few tools available for tracing the source of a network connection. Most of the tools that did exist had to be improvised on the spot. Shimomura and the small group of researchers and federal agents he worked with had to build their own tracing methods as they went. They followed Mitnick from system to system across the network. They worked late nights for weeks. They eventually narrowed his location down to a particular cellular tower in Raleigh, and then to a particular apartment served by that tower, and then to the specific apartment where Mitnick was sleeping when the agents knocked on the door. The arrest and the case that followed was extensively covered. There was a book about it, written by Shimomura together with a journalist, that came out within months of the arrest. There were articles. There were television specials. The image of Mitnick that emerged in the mainstream press coverage was of a dangerous master criminal, capable of bringing down telephone systems and stealing fortunes. The Justice Department, in its case against him, presented him as one of the most dangerous criminals of the computer age. The actual evidence, when it was eventually examined, was more modest. He had stolen software, mostly to read it and learn from it. He had not, by most assessments, profited financially from his hacking. He had been a curious, technically skilled person who had not been able to stop himself from breaking into systems. The hacker community, watching this all happen, became increasingly sympathetic to Mitnick. There was a movement in the late 90s that came to be called Free Kevin, organized by hackers around the country who believed that Mitnick was being unfairly treated. The movement put up bumper stickers. It organized rallies. It pressed for fair treatment of Mitnick under the law. It argued that the prosecution was overreaching, that the actual harm Mitnick had caused was being exaggerated, that he was being made into an example to scare other hackers. The Free Kevin movement was, in some ways, the first time that the hacker community had organized itself as a political constituency, in a sustained and public way. The movement had buttons. It had a website. It had spokespeople. It produced literature explaining its case. It coordinated with civil liberties lawyers. The movement did not, in the end, get Mitnick released early, but it did contribute to a broader shift in how the hacker community thought of itself. Hackers were, the movement argued, a recognizable group of people whose civil liberties deserved to be defended, just as the civil liberties of other groups did. The argument would continue to develop over the following decades, as new cases brought the question up in new forms. Mitnick was eventually sentenced to nearly 5 years in prison, plus a period of supervised release during which he was forbidden to touch a computer or to handle any electronic device with a modem. He served the sentence. He got out in 2000, at the age of 37. After his release, he reinvented himself as a computer security consultant. The skills that had made him a notorious hacker turned out to be valuable, in legal form, to companies that wanted to protect themselves against hackers. He started a consulting business. He wrote books about social engineering. He became, in the second half of his life, a respected figure in the computer security industry. He died of pancreatic cancer in 2023 at the age of 59. The Mitnick story, taken as a whole, illustrated a particular trajectory that several famous hackers of his generation would also follow. They would start as curious teenagers, drift into illegal activities, get caught, serve some time, and then, after their release, become legitimate security professionals. The skills were the same. The activities were similar. The difference was in who was paying them and what their stated purpose was. Hacking, by the late 1990s, was beginning to become a profession. The same activity that had been a criminal offense in one decade became, in the next, a respectable line of work. Chapter 6. A Warehouse in Cambridge. While Mitnick was being pursued by the FBI in the mid-1990s, a different kind of hacker community was forming, a few miles from MIT, in a converted industrial warehouse in the Boston suburb of Cambridge. The community was called LOFE Heavy Industries, with the O in LOFT spelled as a 0, in the manner that had become common in hacker communities by the 90s. The members of LSUPHT were not teenagers. They were mostly in their 20s and 30s. They were people who had been on the hacker scene since the 80s, who had jobs in the technology industry by day, and who spent their evenings and weekends at the warehouse working on projects together. The warehouse contained, by the late 1990s, an extraordinary accumulation of computer equipment. The members had pooled their resources to buy old equipment from various companies that were upgrading. They had servers. They had networking gear. They had specialized hardware of various kinds. They could, in the warehouse, set up small networks that mimicked the networks that companies used in the real world, and could test how various attacks worked against those networks, without affecting any actual production systems. The warehouse became, in this way, a kind of research lab for computer security. The members of LPIT, like most hackers of the period, used pseudonyms in their public work. The pseudonyms were inherited from the bulletin board days, when hackers had used handles rather than real names. The names of the most prominent members had become known within the security community by the late 90s. There was a man called Mudge, who had been one of the founders of the group and who would later become one of its most visible spokespersons. There was Weld Pond, there was Brian Oblivion, there was Kingpin, there was Space Rogue, there was Stefan von Neumann, there was John Tan. The names were, in the hacker tradition, both playful and serious. The members were, in their day jobs, mostly engineers at technology companies. In their evenings at Elzer PAT, they were doing some of the most important security research happening anywhere in the world. The L0PT members had, by the mid-90s, started to think of what they were doing in slightly different terms than the previous generation of hackers had. They were not, mostly, breaking into other people's systems. They were studying how systems could be broken into, on systems they owned themselves, and were publishing what they learned. They were, in effect, building the foundations of an industry. The industry, when it came into existence over the following decade, would be called computer security or information security. The El-Sufit members would be among its founders. The most famous moment in El-Sufit's history came in May of 1998. 7 members of the group, including Mudge and Weld Pond, were called to testify before a committee of the United States Senate, which was holding hearings on government computer security. The 7 hackers showed up in suits, sat at the witness table, and used their pseudonyms. The chairman of the committee, Senator Fred Thompson, addressed them by their handles. The setting was unprecedented. The hackers, who had grown up in basements and bedrooms and warehouses, were being treated as experts by the United States Senate. The hearing has been preserved on video and is available to watch in its entirety more than 2 decades later on various corners of the Internet. The atmosphere of it is striking. The senators ask careful questions. The hackers answer carefully. There is none of the antagonism that might have been expected, given the relationship between the federal government and the hacker community in the years before. The senators are, by all evidence, genuinely curious. They want to understand what the hackers know. They want to figure out, as legislators, what should be done about the state of computer security in the country. The hackers, for their part, are not performing. They are giving honest assessments. They are clear about what they consider the limitations of the current state of affairs. They are willing to make recommendations. What the hackers told the committee during their testimony was that the state of computer security in the United States was, in their assessment, very bad. The systems that the government and major corporations used had, they said, fundamental vulnerabilities that had not been addressed. The members of L0PHT, in their testimony, made the claim that they could, given the existing vulnerabilities, take down the entire Internet within 30 minutes if they decided to do so. The claim was, in retrospect, somewhat exaggerated, but the members made it in good faith, and the senators took it seriously. The testimony was, in its time, a striking moment. The wider public was forced to consider, for the first time, that there were people who understood computer security better than the government, and that those people were not necessarily working for the government. The 30-minute claim, in particular, became famous. It was quoted in newspaper articles. It was repeated in congressional debates over the following years. It became, for a while, a kind of stock phrase used by people who wanted to convey the urgency of computer security as a policy concern. Whether the claim was technically true or not, whether the L0PAT members could really have taken down the internet in 30 minutes, was less important than what it represented. It represented the moment when the older hacker community, the people who had been doing the technical work in their off hours for years, was finally being treated as a source of legitimate expertise by the institutions of the government. The shift had been long in coming. By 1998, it had finally arrived. After the Senate testimony, the L0PAT members became, individually and collectively, well-known figures in the computer security world. Several of them went on to found companies. The pattern of the post-Mitnick era, the hacker who becomes a respected professional, became increasingly common. Mudge, whose real name was Peter Zatko, went on to work at the Defense Department's research arm, then at Google, then at Twitter. The other members took various paths into the legitimate security industry. The warehouse in Cambridge eventually closed. But the model the warehouse had pioneered, of skilled people pooling their resources to do serious security research, and then publishing what they found, became the model that the broader security industry would follow. What L0PIT had demonstrated by the late 1990s was that there was a serious profession waiting to be built around the skills that hackers had been developing in their bedrooms and warehouses. The profession would, over the following decade, become enormous. Companies that had previously thought of computer security as a minor concern started to take it seriously. Universities started to offer degree programs in information security. Government agencies started to hire former hackers in significant numbers. The skills that had been considered, in the early 90s, to be the province of slightly disreputable young people became, by the early 2000s, valuable enough that companies were paying good salaries to acquire them. We're somewhere past the middle of the story by now. There's no particular need to track where we are. If you've drifted in and out, that's exactly what these recordings are for. The voice will keep going, in the same even way it's been going, into the later parts of the story. Let your jaw soften if it's tightened. Let the back of your head settle a little deeper into the pillow. We're in no hurry. We're going to walk through the rest of this gently. Chapter 7. A Convention in the Desert. The professionalization of hacking, which the L0PT testimony had been one symptom of, had been happening in parallel in another venue, which was the annual gathering of hackers that had been organized since the early 1990s by a man named Jeff Moss. Moss had been a young computer enthusiast in Seattle in the late 80s. He had attended the various small hacker gatherings of his teenage years. He had decided, in 1993, when he was about 18, that what the hacker community needed was a larger, more visible annual gathering, where the various scattered sub-communities could meet in person, exchange ideas, learn from each other. He organized the first such gathering in Las Vegas in the summer of 1993. He called it DEF CON. The name had several origins, a reference to the military readiness levels, a reference to a particular bulletin board command, but mostly it was just a phrase that sounded right and that didn't already mean anything else. The first DEF CON had about 100 attendees. They met in a small hotel in Las Vegas. They gave talks to each other. They drank. They explored the strange overlap between the hacker culture they had grown up in and the city of Las Vegas, with its casinos and its showgirls and its desert heat. The gathering was in its first year an experiment. Moss did not know if anyone would come back the next year. They did. The second DEF CON in 1994 had several hundred attendees. The third had more. By the late 1990s, DEF CON had grown to several thousand attendees. By the 2010s, it had over 20,000. It had become, by some measures, the largest hacker gathering in the world. What happened at DEF CON over the years was a particular kind of cultural mixing that has not happened in many other places. The attendees were a strange combination. There were teenage hackers in black t-shirts. There were FBI agents in plain clothes, pretending to be regular attendees, trying to recruit informants. There were corporate security professionals in their 30s and 40s who had been hackers themselves a decade earlier and were now at the conference looking for new hires. There were academic researchers presenting papers on the latest vulnerabilities. There were defense contractors looking for talent. There were journalists. There were artists. There were, increasingly, hackers from other countries, Europe, Asia, South America, who flew in for the week. The talks at DEF CON over the years became one of the main venues where new security research was first announced. A researcher who had figured out a new vulnerability would often save the announcement for DEF CON, where the announcement would have the maximum impact. The talks were recorded. They were watched by people in the security industry around the world in the weeks and months after the conference. A new technique announced at DEF CON would be, within a few weeks, part of the working knowledge of every serious security researcher. Some of the talks became legendary in their own right. There was a talk in 2008 by a young researcher named Dan Kaminsky, who had discovered a serious vulnerability in the system that the entire Internet used to translate human-readable website names into the numerical addresses that computers actually used. The vulnerability, if it had been exploited at scale, could have allowed attackers to redirect a substantial portion of Internet traffic to fake destinations. Kaminsky had, before his DEF CON talk, spent months working quietly with major technology companies to coordinate a fix. The talk at DEF CON was his public unveiling of what he had found after the fix had been deployed. It became one of the most discussed presentations in the conference's history. The model Kaminsky used, quiet coordination first, public disclosure later, became, over the following years, the standard approach for responsibly handling serious vulnerabilities. There was a talk in 2015 by two researchers named Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek, who demonstrated that they could remotely take control of certain models of car. They had, before the talk, arranged with a journalist to be filmed actually doing this on a highway in Missouri, with the journalist behind the wheel. The video they showed at DEF CON included footage of the car being remotely manipulated, its windshield wipers turning on, its radio changing stations, eventually its transmission being cut while the journalist was driving down the highway. The talk caused, in the auto industry, a serious rethinking of how vehicle software should be designed. The company whose cars had been demonstrated, Chrysler, recalled over 1 million vehicles for software updates in the wake of the talk. The pattern of independent researchers forcing major industries to take their products' security seriously by demonstrating vulnerabilities publicly, became, by the late 2010s, a regular feature of the security landscape. The other thing that happened at DEF CON, alongside the talks, was a series of contests and games. There were lockpicking contests. There were capture the flag competitions, in which teams of hackers tried to break into specially prepared computer systems while simultaneously defending their own. There were social engineering contests, in which competitors tried to extract sensitive information from real companies by phone, with the calls recorded and judged for technique. There were various more whimsical events. The contests served partly as entertainment and partly as a way for skilled hackers to demonstrate their abilities in front of the corporate recruiters who attended. Several careers were launched by impressive performances in DEF CON contests. Jeff Moss, the founder, eventually started a second, more corporate conference called Black Hat, which was held immediately before DEF CON each year, also in Las Vegas. Black Hat was meant to be the professional counterpart to DEF CON's more freewheeling culture. The same researchers spoke at both. The same techniques were presented at both. But Black Hat charged thousands of dollars for admission, attracted attendees from major corporations and government agencies, and had a more formal atmosphere. The two conferences together became the central annual event of the global computer security industry. The week in Las Vegas, in late July or early August, came to be called, by people in the industry, Hacker Summer Camp. By the 2010s, the culture that had started in basement clubrooms and bedroom computers had grown into something quite different from what its founders would have predicted. The hackers were professionals now. They worked for large companies. They had benefits and salaries and retirement accounts. They went to conferences in Las Vegas where they had business cards. The skills they had developed as teenagers were now valuable on the open market. The ethic of curiosity and free information sharing that had characterized the earlier era had not entirely disappeared, but it now existed alongside more commercial concerns. The hackers had, by the 2010s, become a recognized profession, with all the institutions and constraints that recognition brought. Alongside DEF CON, throughout the same period, ran a more eccentric strand of the hacker community organized around a group that called itself the Cult of the Dead Cow. The group had been founded in 1984 in Lubbock, Texas, by a handful of teenagers who had met on bulletin board systems. The group's name had been chosen by the founder's own account, mostly because it sounded amusing. The group had no particular ideology in its early years, beyond a general interest in being interesting. Its members produced an electronic newsletter, full of strange humor and occasional technical content, that was distributed through the bulletin board scene for years. What set the Cult of the Dead Cow apart, over time, was that several of its members became unusually serious technical researchers while also keeping the group's characteristically irreverent tone. In 1998, the same year as the L0V8 Senate testimony, the Cult of the Dead Cow released a piece of software called Back Orifice. The software was a tool that, when installed on a Windows computer, would let anyone with the right credentials remotely control the machine. The Cult of the Dead Cow released Back Orifice publicly at the DEF CON conference that year, with considerable theatrical flair. They claimed in their release announcement that they had built the tool to demonstrate the poor state of security in the dominant operating system of the time. Microsoft, which had built the operating system, was not amused. Back Orifice became, briefly, one of the most discussed pieces of hacker software of its era. It was downloaded millions of times. It was used in various ways by various people. It served, more than anything, as a kind of statement that the security holes in mainstream operating systems were so significant that a small group of hackers could write a tool to exploit them and release it for free. The release pushed Microsoft and the rest of the software industry into taking security more seriously than they had previously. The pattern of releasing public proof of concept tools to force the hand of complacent software vendors would be repeated many times in the years that followed. Several members of the Cult of the Dead Cow went on to significant later careers. One of them, who went by the handle Mudge, though confusingly there was a different Mudge in L0PHT and a separate Mudge in the Cult of the Dead Cow, both eventually being identified, became a senior figure in the security industry. Another, who went by the handle Beto O'Rourke, went on to a career in Texas politics, running for the United States Senate and later for President of the United States. The fact that one of the founders of an early hacker group had a parallel life in mainstream American politics became public during O'Rourke's campaigns, and was treated by then as a charming detail rather than as a disqualification. The hacker community had, by the 2010s, become sufficiently legitimate that its alumni could plausibly run for high office. Chapter 8. Anonymous. Around the same time that the professional security industry was settling into its current shape, a quite different kind of hacker community was emerging on the other end of the spectrum. This community was unprofessional, anonymous, motivated by a mix of political grievances and the pleasure of disruption, organized loosely if at all. It came to be known collectively as Anonymous. The origins of Anonymous were in a particular website called 4chan, which had been founded in 2003 as an English-language imitation of certain Japanese image-sharing sites. The most active part of 4chan was a section called the Random Board, which posted under the title /B. The Random Board was, by most accounts, one of the strangest places on the Internet. A chaotic stream of images and short messages posted by mostly anonymous users, ranging from harmless jokes to genuinely disturbing material, with no moderation to speak of. The culture of the Random Board was built around the idea that posters had no identity. Everyone posted under the default username, which was Anonymous. Over time, the regulars of the board started to refer to themselves, collectively, by that name. Anonymous was not originally a hacker group. It was originally a loose internet subculture, defined more by a shared sense of humor and a shared culture of anonymity than by any particular set of skills or goals. Anonymous, as a hacker group, came into existence in early 2008 in response to a particular incident involving the Church of Scientology. The church had managed to get a video of the actor Tom Cruise, in which Cruise was speaking in unusual ways about the church's beliefs, removed from various websites that had hosted it. The anonymous community on 4chan and similar sites decided that this was an unacceptable act of internet censorship. They organized, very loosely, a campaign of harassment against the Church of Scientology. They called the campaign Project Chinology. The campaign involved various activities, flooding the church's websites with traffic to make them unavailable, ordering pizza deliveries to church offices, prank calling church members, and eventually organizing in-person protests outside Scientology buildings in cities around the world. The protests, at which participants wore Guy Fawkes masks to preserve their anonymity, attracted thousands of people. The masks became, over the following years, the public symbol of Anonymous. What Project Chinology demonstrated, more than any particular effect it had on the Church of Scientology, was that the loose internet subculture that had grown up on 4chan could organize into a kind of political force, at least temporarily, when it found a target that united the participants. Over the following years, various other anonymous campaigns followed. There was a campaign in support of the website WikiLeaks, after the website's payment processors cut off its funding in 2010. There was a campaign in support of the protesters in the Arab Spring uprisings, in which anonymous members tried to help protesters bypass internet censorship in various Middle Eastern countries. There were campaigns against various corporations and governments that the participants considered objectionable. The campaigns were, individually, of varying effectiveness. Some had real impact. Some were largely symbolic. But collectively, they made Anonymous, for a period of about 5 years, one of the most discussed phenomena on the Internet. The technical attacks that Anonymous used were, by professional security standards, mostly unsophisticated. They primarily involved what are called distributed denial of service attacks, in which the participants overwhelm a target website with so much traffic that it cannot respond to legitimate users. The tool that was used most often was called the low-orbit ion cannon, which had been originally written for legitimate testing purposes but which had been adapted by the anonymous community for use in attacks. Anyone who wanted to participate in an anonymous campaign could download the tool, configure it to point at the target, and contribute to the attack. The participants were called, in their own jargon, Anons. There were thousands of them, scattered around the world, organized only by the rough consensus of what the next target should be. In 2011, a small group within Anonymous, who were significantly more technically capable than the average participant, broke off and formed their own group. They called themselves Lulzsec, after the internet expression for laughs. Lulzsec, over a period of 50 days in the summer of 2011, conducted a series of much more sophisticated attacks against various corporate and government targets. They broke into the websites of Sony, the United States Senate, the CIA, the British newspaper The Sun, and various other organizations. They published the stolen data publicly. They did, by their own description, mostly for the fun of it, for the lulz. The Sony breach, in particular, was massive. Lulzsec had gotten into the Sony Pictures website and extracted the personal information of over 1 million customers. They had also gotten into other Sony systems and stolen various proprietary documents. The breach cost Sony tens of millions of dollars. The fact that a small group of internet activists could cause that much damage to one of the world's largest media companies, in a matter of days, was a kind of demonstration that by 2011 made many people in the security industry rethink what was possible. The CIA website breach was technically less significant. LulzSec had only managed to make the public-facing website temporarily unavailable, not actually broken into any CIA systems. But the symbolic value was enormous. A group of mostly young people scattered around the world using free tools had succeeded in embarrassing the United States Central Intelligence Agency on its own website. The story was on the front pages of newspapers around the world. The group's public persona on Twitter and on various other channels was an unusual mix of teenage humor and serious technical capability. Their public communications, mostly written by one of the group's members, were funny in a particular dry way. They taunted their targets directly. They taunted law enforcement. They created the impression, for the brief period of their existence, that they were operating on a different plane than the institutions they were attacking. LulzSec was in many ways a deliberate provocation. Its members knew they would be caught eventually. They wanted to be entertaining while they lasted. Their public communications were funny in a particular dry internet style. They taunted their targets. They taunted law enforcement. They became, briefly, the most discussed hacker group in the world. Then, after 50 days, they announced that they were disbanding. They said the operation had been a brief one by design. They published a goodbye statement and disappeared. What had actually happened behind the scenes was that one of the LulzSec members had been arrested by the FBI a few weeks earlier and had agreed to cooperate. His name was Hector Monsegur. He had been the most active member of the group, posting under the handle Sabu. He had been the de facto leader of LulzSec, the person who chose the targets, who coordinated the attacks, who wrote most of the public communications. Monsegur had been, in his ordinary life, a 30-year-old man living in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in a public housing project, where he was raising two of his cousin's children, whom he had taken in after his cousin had gone to prison. He had been unemployed for some time before his arrest. His hacking activities had been, by his own later account, an outlet for a kind of restless energy that he had not been able to direct into anything else in his life. He had been good at what he did. He had also been, when the FBI showed up at his apartment in June of 2011, immediately willing to cooperate, because he was afraid of being separated from the children he was raising. The FBI gave Monsegur a chance to avoid prison if he would help them catch the other members of LulzSec. He agreed. For the second half of the group's 50-day run, Monsegur was, secretly, an FBI informant. He continued to lead the group's activities. He encouraged them to take particular actions, to attack particular targets, to make particular announcements. The other members trusted him completely. He had been their leader. They had no reason to suspect that the leader of their operation was, by then, working for the police. After his arrest, he had continued to participate in the group's activities, but as an FBI informant, recording everything the other members did and said. When LulzSec announced its dissolution in the summer of 2011, the FBI was already in possession of detailed evidence about the identities and activities of the remaining members. Over the following year, most of them were arrested in various countries on various charges. The group's lifespan as a free organization had been about 50 days, exactly as advertised. What no one outside the group had known while it was operating was that one of its core members had been working for the police throughout the second half of its run. Monsager, after the prosecutions of his former colleagues were complete, was sentenced to time served, having spent only 7 months in jail. He had given the FBI everything they had asked for. The other members of the group received longer sentences. There was, in the hacker community after the prosecutions, a long and bitter discussion about what Monsager had done, about whether his cooperation had been forgivable given the circumstances of his life, or whether it had been a betrayal of his colleagues. The discussion did not, in the end, reach a resolution. People held different views. The pattern of a key member of a hacker group being turned by federal authorities would recur in various forms in the years that followed, and would shape the way later hacker groups thought about their own internal trust. After the Lulzsec arrests, the broader anonymous movement continued for several more years, but it never recovered the cultural moment it had enjoyed during 2011. The energy that had powered it dissipated. The participants drifted away to other interests. The masks remained as a kind of cultural symbol, but the active movement faded. By the late 2010s, Anonymous was mostly a memory. The phenomenon had been brief, intense, and characteristic of a particular moment in Internet history. Chapter 9. When Countries Started Doing It. For most of the history we've walked through so far, hackers have been mostly individuals or small groups. The people doing the hacking have been motivated by curiosity, by political grievance, by the pleasure of disruption, by various personal reasons. They have not, mostly, been agents of governments. They have not been part of organized military or intelligence operations. That changed gradually over the course of the 2010s. By the middle of that decade, the most significant hacking activity in the world was no longer being done by individuals or small groups. It was being done by the intelligence agencies and military organizations of various governments. With budgets and resources far beyond what any private group could muster. Hacking had become, by then, a tool of statecraft. The old image of the hacker as a teenager in a bedroom had become, in the world of consequential cyber attacks, almost entirely obsolete. The first major sign of this shift had come in 2010, when a piece of computer code was discovered by researchers at a small security company in Belarus that did not fit any of the patterns of previous malicious software. The code, which came to be called Stuxnet, was extraordinarily sophisticated. It had been designed to attack a very specific kind of industrial control system, the kind used in uranium enrichment facilities. It had been delivered, somehow, into the closed network at the Iranian nuclear facility at Natanz. It had caused the centrifuges at that facility to spin in slightly wrong patterns, just slightly enough that the centrifuges would break, but slowly enough that the Iranians had not been able to figure out why their equipment kept failing. The code had been operating in the Natanz facility for over a year before it was discovered. The sophistication of Stuxnet, when it was studied in detail by the security community, was remarkable in several ways. The code had to solve a particular problem that no public hacker had ever solved at this scale. The network at the Natanz facility, like the networks at most secure industrial sites, was not connected to the public internet. There was no way for the attackers to deliver the code remotely. The code had to be carried into the facility in some way by someone or something with physical access. Stuxnet had been designed to spread, in its early stages, through removable USB drives. Someone, somewhere, exactly who has never been publicly confirmed, had to have arranged for an infected USB drive to be plugged into a computer that had access to the closed network. Once on the inside, Stuxnet would propagate, find the specific kind of industrial control system it had been designed for, and begin its careful, slow sabotage. The technical reading of Stuxnet that emerged over the following years made clear that the operation was, by any reasonable standard, an act of warfare. It was not espionage. It was direct physical damage to another country's infrastructure, conducted through computer networks. The fact that the attack had been carried out without bullets and without bombs did not, in any moral or legal sense, change what it had been. It was a different kind of military operation, but it was still a military operation. The Iranian government, when it eventually figured out what had happened, took the attack seriously and began rapidly building up its own cyber capabilities in response. The world had, by the early 2010s, entered an era in which most major nation-states were both conducting and defending against cyber operations of various kinds. When security researchers analyzed Stuxnet, after its discovery, they realized that the code was unlike anything any private group could have built. It used multiple previously unknown vulnerabilities in Windows, the kind that, in the commercial market, would have been worth millions of dollars each. It contained code that demonstrated detailed knowledge of the specific industrial equipment used at Natanz. It had been put together by what was clearly a team of highly skilled engineers with substantial resources and a specific intelligence target. It was, by general consensus, a nation-state operation. The most plausible candidates for who had built it were the United States and Israel, working together. Neither government has ever officially confirmed this, but the technical evidence and the reporting that has emerged since have made the attribution almost universally accepted. Stuxnet was the first major publicly visible nation-state cyber attack. It was not the last. Over the following decade, various nation-state hacking groups were identified and tracked by the security community. There were groups that researchers came to associate with the Russian government, given names like Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. There were groups associated with the Chinese government, given names like Apt-1 and Apt-41. There were groups associated with North Korea, with Iran, with various smaller countries. The naming convention was almost whimsical, but the actual operations the groups conducted were not. They were sustained, well-funded campaigns of intelligence gathering and, in some cases, of disruption. A particularly important moment in the history of nation-state hacking came in the summer of 2016, when a group calling itself the Shadow Brokers began publishing, online, a series of internal hacking tools that had apparently been stolen from the United States National Security Agency. The tools were sophisticated. They included exploits for previously unknown vulnerabilities in Windows, in various network appliances, in various other widely used systems. The shadow brokers continued releasing tools over the following months. By April of 2017, they had released some of the most dangerous of the tools, including one called Eternal Blue, which exploited a particular vulnerability in older versions of Windows in a way that could spread rapidly across networks. What happened next, in May and June of 2017, was that Eternal Blue was incorporated into several pieces of criminal malware, and those pieces of malware spread around the world. The WannaCry ransomware outbreak in May affected hospitals, factories, and government systems in over 100 countries. The NotPetya outbreak in June was even worse, causing billions of dollars in damage to shipping companies, pharmaceutical companies, and various other organizations. The criminal use of NSA tools, once those tools had been stolen and published, had become one of the costliest categories of cybercrime in history. The episode raised, for many people, a serious question about whether the practice of governments stockpiling computer vulnerabilities for their own use was a good idea, given that those stockpiles could, evidently, be stolen and weaponized against ordinary civilian targets. The operations these groups conducted ranged across the entire space of cyber activity. There were intelligence operations in which nation-state hackers broke into government and corporate systems to steal documents and emails. There were disruption operations in which they attacked critical infrastructure to cause damage. There were influence operations in which they used hacked materials and fake social media accounts to try to influence public opinion in other countries. The most famous of these influence operations, in the late 2010s, was the Russian campaign to influence the American presidential election of 2016, which involved hacking the email accounts of various American political figures and then releasing the contents through WikiLeaks at strategic moments during the campaign. The shift to nation-state hacking changed the character of the hacker community in particular ways. The people doing the actual technical work for these state operations were still, often, individuals with backgrounds that resembled those of earlier hackers. They had grown up curious about computers. They had been on the bulletin boards in the 90s. They had attended DEF CONs, but they were now working for governments with security clearances on classified projects. Their work was no longer being done out of curiosity. It was being done for reasons of national interest. The romance of the lone hacker, exploring systems for the pleasure of exploration, had been replaced by the more institutional reality of the salaried government employee, working in a secure facility, doing what the government asked them to do. The hacker community, which had been a loose subculture for most of its history, found itself increasingly divided by the rise of nation-state operations. There were hackers who worked for governments, openly or quietly. There were hackers who worked for the private security industry. There were hackers who worked as researchers, publishing their findings publicly. There were hackers who remained as freelance criminals, breaking into systems for profit. There were hackers who tried to remain in the older spirit, doing the activity for fun and learning. The community, by the 2020s, was no longer one community. It was many communities, with different goals and different paymasters that shared, increasingly distantly, a common technical lineage. Soften your face once more. Let your shoulders fall. The story has just one more chapter, and then a small close, and then quiet. We're past the difficult middle. From here, things wind down gently. There's nothing in what's coming that you need to grip onto. The names will pass by, the way they have been passing by. We're nearly home. Chapter 10. What it has become. What hacking has become in the present day is something quite different from what any of the figures we've talked about tonight would have predicted. The activity that started as a hobby among college students in a basement at MIT in the late 1950s has, over the 70 years since, grown into a sprawling and complicated industry, with deep institutional roots and a strange relationship to the rest of society. There is today a vast professional security industry, which the LUP8 members and their contemporaries helped to create. The industry is worth, by various estimates, well over $100 billion a year worldwide. It employs millions of people. It includes companies that sell security software, companies that provide security consulting, companies that monitor networks for intrusions, companies that conduct penetration testing on behalf of paying clients, companies that train security professionals. The people who work in this industry are, in many cases, the descendants, professionally and sometimes literally, of the earlier hackers. They go to DEF CON. They read 2600. They tell stories about Mitnick. They have inherited the older culture even while they work in legitimate corporate roles. There is also a system of bug bounties, which has become one of the more interesting institutional developments of the last decade. A bug bounty is a program, run by a company, that pays outside researchers for finding vulnerabilities in the company's products. The researcher finds a bug. The researcher reports it to the company through a formal channel rather than exploiting it or selling it to anyone else. The company pays the researcher a reward, ranging from a few $100s to, in some cases, hundreds of thousands. Bug bounties have created a kind of legitimate marketplace for the skills that, a generation earlier, would have only had an underground market. A young person who is good at finding security vulnerabilities can now make a living openly by reporting them to the companies whose products contain them. The bug bounty system has its own internal culture, with its own institutions and characters. There are platforms like HackerOne and BugCrowd that connect researchers with companies that want their products tested. There are leaderboards on which the most successful researchers compete for recognition. There are conferences specifically for bug bounty hunters. There are researchers who make six-figure incomes purely from bug bounties, finding vulnerabilities on a freelance basis for various companies. The skills involved in this work are, in many cases, the same skills that earlier generations of hackers used to break into systems illegally. The difference is the relationship to the law and to the system owners. The activity is permitted. The compensation is open. The work, while still requiring the same kind of curious, system-questioning temperament, has been moved into a legitimate economic frame. There are, alongside the legitimate industry, the criminal organizations that conduct ransomware operations. Ransomware is a particular kind of malicious software that encrypts the files on a victim's computer system and demands payment for the decryption key. Ransomware operations, by the 2020s, had become one of the largest categories of cybercrime. They were conducted, in many cases, by organized criminal groups operating out of countries where they were not subject to American or European law enforcement. The amounts of money involved had grown to billions of dollars per year. The victims included hospitals, schools, local governments, large corporations. The ransomware industry was, in many ways, the dark mirror of the legitimate security industry. Using similar techniques, requiring similar skills, but applied for direct financial extortion rather than for protection. Particular ransomware incidents, over the years, became famous in their own right. There was the WannaCry attack of May 2017, which affected hospitals across the United Kingdom and prevented surgeries from being conducted. There was the Colonial Pipeline attack of May 2021, which shut down the largest gasoline pipeline on the American East Coast for several days, causing fuel shortages and panic buying across multiple states. There was the JB's attack of June 2021, which disrupted one of the world's largest meat producers. There were attacks on hundreds of American cities and towns, paralyzing local government services for weeks at a time. The pattern was consistent. A small criminal group would gain access to a target organization's network, deploy the ransomware, encrypt as many systems as possible, and then demand payment in cryptocurrency for the decryption keys. Many of the targets paid. Many did not. The economics of the operation were, from the criminal perspective, very favorable. The attackers were rarely caught. The victims, by the time they recovered, had often paid out millions of dollars. The response to ransomware on the part of governments and the security industry has been an active area of work throughout the 2020s. The FBI has, in various publicized operations, infiltrated ransomware groups and recovered some of the cryptocurrency payments that victims had made. The American government has imposed sanctions on countries that harbor ransomware operators. The cyber insurance industry, which had been profitable in the 2010s, found itself paying out enormous claims and started to change its terms accordingly. The whole landscape of how organizations defend themselves against attack and how they recover when attacks succeed has been reshaped in the last decade by the ransomware industry. The work of dealing with it is ongoing. It is, as of these recordings, one of the most active fronts in the broader cyber landscape. There are, alongside both of these, the various nation-state operations that we touched on earlier, which continue at varying intensities depending on the geopolitical moment. There are the various activist groups, of which Anonymous was the largest example but which continue in smaller forms. There are individual hobbyists, still scattered around the world, who pursue the activity in something like the original spirit, for the pleasure of understanding how things work. The hacker community, taken as a whole, is now a vast and varied thing, with parts that have very little to do with each other except for a distant common ancestry. What has been preserved through all of these changes is something more atmospheric than institutional. There is a particular way of thinking that the hackers we have walked through tonight all shared, even though they did very different things. They were curious about how systems worked. They were not, generally, satisfied with the official explanation of how a thing was supposed to work. They wanted to figure it out for themselves, by taking it apart, by trying things, by sharing what they learned with a few other people who were interested. This way of thinking is the original hacker ethic. It is still alive. It is alive in the bug bounty hunters, in the security researchers, in the people who run conferences, in the people who read 2600 still. It is alive in some of the people doing the more questionable work too, even when their methods have become problematic. The way of thinking has outlasted the technical specifics of any particular era. It will probably continue to exist in some form as long as there are technical systems for people to be curious about. Closing. The story we've walked through tonight has been, in many ways, the story of how a single word changed its meaning. The word at the start of the story meant something that almost no one outside a small community had heard of. By the end of the story, it had become a household term, used in news headlines, in movie titles, in casual conversation. The thing the word referred to had also changed. What had been an obscure hobby had become, by various paths, a global industry, a tool of statecraft, an underground economy of crime, and a cultural archetype. What the story has not been, despite what you might expect from the news coverage of any individual hacking incident, is a story about technology, mostly. The technology has shifted enormously over the 70 years we've walked through. The computers of the late 1950s, where the story started, were the size of refrigerators and were programmed in machine code. The computers of the present day, where the story ends, are the size of pocket cards and run software so complicated that no individual could fully understand it. The technical landscape is, in some sense, unrecognizable from one end of the story to the other. What has not changed across that whole arc is the human dimension. The people in the story have, in their different eras, been doing more or less the same thing. They have been figuring out how systems work. They have been pushing on the edges of what the systems were designed to do. They have been sharing what they learned with each other in the channels available to them. They have been balancing curiosity against the rules of the institutions around them in various ways, with various consequences. The activity at its center is one that humans have been doing for as long as there have been technical systems, in one form or another. The activity will probably keep happening, in whatever form the technology takes in the future. What the story is mostly, then, is a story about a kind of person. A particular temperament. A particular way of being curious about the world. The hackers we've walked through tonight have all shared this temperament, even when they have done very different things with it. The college students at MIT shared it. The phone freaks shared it. The bedroom hackers of the 80s shared it. The L0PHT members shared it. The DEF CON attendees shared it. The anonymous participants shared it in their own way. The nation-state hackers, the bug bounty hunters, the ransomware operators, all of them, in different forms and to different ends, are people with this same fundamental curiosity about systems. The thing about this temperament, which is perhaps worth noticing, is that it is not unique to hacking. The same kind of curiosity, applied to other domains, has produced people who took apart cars, people who studied insects, people who learned languages no one else spoke, people who explored caves, people who memorized maps for the pleasure of memorizing them. The activity of hacking, in this view, is one particular expression of a broader human tendency, the tendency some people have, more strongly than others, to want to know how things work, and to want to know it by working through the things themselves rather than by being told. The technical systems that hackers have explored over the past 70 years happen to be a particular set of objects that happen to be available at a particular moment in history. The temperament that has driven the exploration has been around much longer. You don't need to remember any of the specific people, or any of the specific events, or any of the specific techniques. The names will fade. The dates will fade. What might be worth carrying in some quiet way is just the small observation that the activity you've been hearing about tonight has been, throughout its history, mostly the activity of ordinary curious people. Not magicians, not supercriminals, just people who liked to figure out how things worked, who got better at it over time, who eventually became part of something larger than they had originally intended. The story is, in this sense, a familiar one. The story of a small subculture that grew, over decades, into something its founders would not have recognized, while still, in some quiet ways, being recognizably itself. The room is quiet. The hour is late. Somewhere, even now, in a bedroom or a warehouse or a government facility or a corporate office, someone is doing more or less what the figures of tonight's story have always done. They are sitting at a screen. They are figuring out how something works. The work is going on in the background of the world, the way it has been going on for the last 70 years. It will keep going. There's nothing in any of it that needs to keep you awake. Sleep well.